So I'm Phil Grunewald. I'm based in the Department of Engineering Science here at Oxford and have spent many happy years with the Oxford Energy Network. And that's why it's a particular pleasure for me today to introduce Ben Caldecott. Ben is one of our genuine Oxford Energy heavyweights and epitomizes what we pride ourselves here at Oxford Energy with big and cross-boundary thinking. Ben specializes in environment, energy, and broadly sustainability issues right across finance, public policy, and academia. Ben is the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. He's got a long list of very high-profile responsibilities. I tried to look it up online, and the list just got longer and longer. So some of the highlights I want to share with you are that he's a trustee of the Green Alliance. He is for the University of Oxford, on the Socially Responsible Investment Review Committee, for the Prince of Wales' Accounting for Sustainability project, and he's also a COP26 strategy advisor for finance at the UK Cabinet Office. All this is probably down to his pretty rounded education, because he has been to both Oxford and Cambridge. And on top of that, he's a visiting scholar at Stanford. Now, the most exciting and recent news is that Ben has been appointed as the first ever Lombard Aldia Associate Professor in Sustainable Finance, which has been made possible this summer. So he is now an associate professor at the School of Geography and the Environment, which is a real major step forward for him, but also for us more generally. So congratulations, Ben, on this major achievement. Just to warn you all, if you want to say anything outrageous, you can ask questions, put them in the chat, and we'll go through them. But if you want to be very outrageous, be warned that this is all being recorded by Anne, and we might want to post some of the recordings on our website. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to Ben to tell us about objectively assessing the incompatibility of power assets with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. Over to you, Ben.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Philip, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. Hopefully that's working. I have changed the title ever so slightly since proposing the original title back in what was must have been, well, definitely pre-COVID, but probably December or even before then. But I am still going to talk about this question of compatibility or incompatibility of power generation assets with Paris, but I wanted to kind of nest that in a broader context around debates on how to align investment portfolios and bank loan books with climate change, something that is hotting up and is very important. I also wanted to say a bit about work that we've done since I originally proposed this title, or the original title, beyond the power sector. So there's work that we've now done and are doing in my team on cement and iron and steel, which are also very relevant. And we can apply the methodologies that I'm going to talk a bit about for power to those other sectors, and indeed to other sectors. So forgive me for changing the title slightly, but hopefully that will be of interest. So what I'm going to talk about first is the need to focus on alignment and Paris alignment in particular, particularly in finance. That's in contrast to a lot of the focus actually, or certainly the focus over the last 5 years, which has really been about risk management. And whilst they are similar, they're not the same. I'll say a tiny bit about current approaches to measuring incompatibility or compatibility and what's wrong with them. I'll set out this better bottom-up approach for measuring compatibility for power, and also explain how this can be applied to those other two sectors I mentioned, cement and iron and steel. And then I wanted to wrap up by kind of highlighting some of the work we're doing with colleagues at the Alan Turing Institute and the Satellite Applications Catapult, and with others on what we call spatial finance, which is the integration of geospatial data into financial analysis or financial theory and practice, which is really important for many of the things that we're interested in. Firstly, understanding whether assets in the real economy are compatible with different ecological thresholds, including climate change, but also other ones, and to what extent those assets are exposed to different risks that could result in asset stranding. So quite a bit to get through. I'm going to proceed at pace, but feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'm going to try and figure out whether I can actually see the I've lost all visual. Hang on, sorry guys. All right, well, I can't see. I know I'm broadcasting, but I can't see any chat. So maybe if you want to interrupt me if you've got a question, I'll try and get the chat function back up. Oh, something just popped up. Yeah, cool. All right, I can see that now. Thanks, Phil. All right, so we need to focus on alignment. What am I going on about here? So just a bit of context, particularly for those of you who don't might not spend a lot of time focused on climate finance, sustainable finance, ESG, those sorts of things. But you may recall, it might prompt a memory that Mark Carney, the then governor of the Bank of England, gave a big speech back in 2015, September 2015, talking about how climate-related risks were in the mandate of central banks and supervisors, specifically the mandate of the Bank of England, and that was something they were really concerned about. That's spurred a lot of different work, which we could talk about a lot. But one thing in particular, which is this Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the Tcfd, which has been referred to more and more. And this is essentially a framework for preparers of disclosure, which include companies, but also include financial institutions, to systematically assess and then disclose their risk exposure. So it's a climate risk management mechanism, CRM mechanism. And that's important because you want institutions to systematically think about their climate risk exposures and then do something about it. That is not, however, the same thing as aligning your company or your financial institution with the Paris Agreement or other climate targets or carbon budgets. And unfortunately, what's happened over the last 5 or so years, since it was launched about five years ago. So the 5-year Paris anniversary is in December, the 12th of December, and it was announced during the Paris summit, COP21. But over that period, what's happened is that a lot of institutions are saying, we're doing this disclosure regime, we're doing TCFD. Isn't that amazing? Aren't we now tackling climate change? And whilst there is this overlap, they are quite, as I said, quite different things. So you can imagine a company can be exposed to carbon pricing, which is a form of climate-related transition risk, and it can move its production to China, carbon leakage. Is that making the world a better place? Is it helping to tackle climate change? In fact, it could be making climate change harder to tackle. Or a company B in the same scenario could decide to install measures to significantly reduce its emissions, and that would be aligned. That would be an overlap between tackling the risk and improving climate outcomes. But they're quite different scenarios, and companies and investors can pick these quite different strategies. So this is a sort of an active discussion, debate. People are now talking a lot about how we should move more towards aligning with climate outcomes, the ACO here. And over the summer, I wrote something kind of setting out what I thought the different pillars were of alignment with climate outcomes from a financial institution perspective. And here are the 3 pillars, and the talk is really focused on the first pillar. So I'm not talking about the other 2, although I can send you links to other things I've written about that, and these are areas of active research for me and my group. So the thing that we'll focus on is how do you properly measure, track, and target compatibility or levels of incompatibility. These are grouped around asset level approaches to measurement, which I'll talk about in a sec. The second pillar is, you can have a lot of things that are green or a lot of things that are compatible with a carbon budget. That's, if you're a financial institution, that doesn't necessarily mean you've actually made a difference. And this is something I don't want to get into here, but it's quite an important distinction, because a lot of the regulation, a lot of the thinking around sustainable finance is focused on, if you're an investor, you should hold a lot of things, parking how you define, say, greenness, you should hold a lot of green things, and the more green things you hold, the better you are at making a contribution to sustainability outcomes. One thing I argue is that that's not actually the case. And then the third pillar is around really kind of governance questions, and how over time institutions need to be able to create the right incentives, the right governance structures, operate by certain principles to make sure this stuff is embedded properly over time. And that's a whole other area of work. But what I want to focus on today is the first thing. So very crudely, a lot of the current approaches to measuring compatibility or incompatibility in relation to climate change are focused on versions of kind of carbon footprinting, or they look at emissions intensity of different assets. So you've got a company, and that company is exposed to a bunch of different climate-related risks. These are just some physical risks and transition risks. And what people do is they spend a long time, they go through CDP data, this is the Carbon Disclosure Project, and at the parent company level, and go, okay, well, if this company has got more emissions, a higher emissions intensity, more emissions per unit of output, then it's going to be more exposed to some of these risks than one that has a lower emissions intensity. And over time, you want emissions intensity to go down. Now, there are all sorts of data issues around getting that information. A lot of the self-reported, the disclosures by definition are self-reported, have significant errors in them. If you speak to anyone who works closely with that data, they can give you lots of anecdotes about how companies make significant errors in their reporting of emissions, getting confused about whether they should report emissions from their headquarters or the supermarkets they own or whatever it might be. Adding zeros, missing zeros. And a lot of effort goes into cleaning that data. And for companies, there are lots of companies, of course, that don't disclose. How do you plug the gaps in that? Well, there are lots of people and lots of companies that have black box methodologies that try and estimate the carbon emissions of companies. Now, I don't want to go on too long about this, but as you can probably tell, I think this is not a great way of doing things for the reasons around coverage and data quality, but also, is it really measuring the thing that we're interested in? Is it really measuring the risks? Is it really measuring the impacts that companies are having? So focusing on emissions and carbon budgets and climate change, what would be a better way of going about this? And the first step, I think, is to recognize that climate change is not just a flow issue, it's a stock and flow issue. And this is the infamous bathtub that I'm not going to spend any time on, because you know what it means. We're interested in the cumulative stock of carbon in the atmosphere, and that's what drives global warming. And all the current measures are focused on understanding the flow. And so how do we move towards a stock flow approach? This should all be, I'm sure for the audience, is fine. This also very simple, but just as a sort of a real world example, of if you're focused on the flow and the intensity, or the efficiency rather, the carbon efficiency of an asset, you can end up making decisions that are actually bad for the climate. So this is an example of, okay, you've got an old coal-fired power station and you could replace it with 100% renewables plus storage in 5 years' time, which there'll be people on this call better placed than me to predict when that would be possible in different markets, but I don't think that is a unrealistic proposition. So that's one option, or you could replace the coal-fired power station today with a new gas-fired power station. And of course, there are lots of companies out there that will go, and indeed countries that will go, well, obviously we should go for the gas, because it's, from a carbon perspective, it's twice as efficient, and surely that's the thing we should do. Parking, other questions around particulate matter, but just focusing on carbon emissions. But if you tot up the lifetime emissions of those two choices, the gas-fired power station is likely to operate for much longer, and therefore over the lifetime have more carbon lock-in, greater committed cumulative carbon emissions. And so what we're trying to do is to understand that dynamic, and this is for a paper I was a co-author of with people that you'll know, Cameron and Alex Pfeiffer, looking at the committed cumulative carbon emissions, or the carbon lock-in, of all current and planned power assets globally, and comparing that with carbon budgets for the power sector. So far so good. Let's think about how we now apply this to companies and the sort of decisions that financial institutions are making. So the sort of the steps we're running through here to measure incompatibility or compatibility are as follows. So one, we're doing this at an asset level. So we're doing it by power station in this case, but it could be other emitting assets, as we'll get to, as I'll show you later. And we want that by sector. So in the power sector, that's simple, power stations. Really important for the purposes of, hang on, sorry, let me see these questions. Okay, I'm sorry about the grey boxes. Hopefully,
there was
fine.
About the incompatibility referring to CRM or ACO and ACO.
Oh, it was a while ago. Okay. Right. So anyway, we need this asset level data, but for it to be relevant for financial use cases, you also need to know who owns the assets, because you want to be able to connect the asset to the company and then to the security. So that's the first thing we need to do. We also need to decide on a global carbon budget and then allocate that to the sector in question. And of course, there are then all sorts of issues you could get into around how you allocate carbon budgets and who to, and issues of equity and so on. But keeping it relatively simple, let's focus on a sectoral allocation for a given carbon budget targeting a particular warming threshold. So that's 2 and 3. 4 is okay. Well, we know where the assets are, but we've got to characterize them and understand, how they're being used and their emissions, and we've also got to try and make some sort of assessment of what their emissions will be in the future, and how long they'll operate, and so on and so forth. And then the fifth thing, as you'll see, is we can order them in different ways. And all the charts I'll show you in a sec are ordered by efficiency, carbon efficiency. But there are different ways of ordering them, and that can give you different results, and that's quite important. But these 5 things allow us to see which assets or portfolios of assets are compatible or incompatible with different carbon budgets. So let's put this in. Let's make this visual. So this is what we call a carbon lock-in curve. Now each column, you won't be able to see. You need to kind of zoom in, but each column is a power station. The height of the column reflects the carbon intensity of that particular asset, and the width of each column is the committed cumulative carbon emissions of each asset, and then the vertical lines represent different carbon budgets allocated to the global power sector. So you have AR5 on the far left. You then have SR 1.5, and then SR 1.5, and then AR5 for 2 degrees, and then AR5 for 3 degrees. And all the assets to the right of each of those lines is incompatible with that carbon budget. So that's the framework we're using to determine which assets are compatible or incompatible. And one of the good things about this is, of course, the assumptions can be changed transparently. You can use different carbon budgets. You can change individual asset level assumptions. And then, as I said before, you can order this in different ways. And so one of the things that we're looking at, wanting to do more on, is how you would order these with cost information, and that throws up some challenges and opportunities that we could discuss. So, sort of applying this now. So this is, again, all the world's power stations, current and planned, using, and I'll come to the data sources in a second. We've identified the assets in Australia to see what proportion of assets are compatible with different carbon budgets for Australia, and you can see the results here. Or incompatible, sorry, percent of assets that are incompatible with each warming threshold. So for 3 degrees AR5 budget, it's only 3.2% that are incompatible, and obviously the number goes up. And you'll know that the SR 1.5 carbon budget is actually bigger than the AR5 1.5 degree carbon budget, which explains that. So it's kind of going to be interesting to see what happens with AR6. And here is looking now at a specific company in Australia. So this is Origin Energy. So we know which assets Origin Energy owns, and we can then compare Origin Energy to AGL Energy, which is another Australian power utility. And so from an investor perspective, you can go, okay, well, there are these two companies. That's interesting. That might inform your view of how risky they are. It might also inform some kind of engagement action. Let's talk to AGL about why they've got so many assets that are incompatible, or hang on, they're planning to build this power station, this new gas-fired power station, and and that's going to, from our analysis, going to take them over a certain boundary and make it incompatible. How are they explaining that or justifying that? Especially because last year their CEO said they were going to be Paris aligned. So it creates a framework to provide additional scrutiny. These are more examples of companies. This is Malaysia, and you can go on, right? Indonesia, PTPLN, which is one of the big utility in Indonesia, etc., with different country results. This analysis actually from slides from a while ago, and we've made significant progress since then, which I'll tell you a bit about in a sec. Now, the other thing that I'm kind of actively thinking a bit about is obviously that whether something is compatible with a given warming threshold isn't static. Because the carbon budget is constantly changing. We're constantly eating away at it, and the state of science is evolving. So the AR6 question is super interesting, because the budget will likely be, all things being equal, it'll be smaller, but developments in the science might result in a significant revision to the size of that budget. Assets could be utilized more or less, depending. Assets could become stranded. They might be closed prematurely, which would result in more budget. So there are a number of things that are sort of moving. And one of the challenges in the sort of the current way that this is talked about, particularly in the financial discourse related to climate change, is that people don't recognize or don't really pay much attention to the fact that it's not static. It's kind of they want a static analysis. And so one thing we're thinking about is how do we introduce and acknowledge these uncertainties within these assessments so that companies can set appropriate targets. So in a given year, I want a proportion of my assets to be compatible, a rising proportion of my assets to be compatible with a given carbon budget for a given confidence level. what does that look like, and how do we operationalize it? And so I don't have an answer to that yet. This is something that we're looking at, but keen to get feedback on these ideas. We've also kind of put together a platform to access these data sets and create your own clicks for any country or any company, any power utility. This is actually a little video from about 2 years ago, and it's now significantly better than this. So I'm not going to go through the video other than to say, if you want to look at this and create your own clicks, you can do so. And I think that could become, we hope it will become, well, we know it's becoming a tool for institutions, financial institutions, to assess compatibility and incompatibility, but it can also become a way for customers to assess the plans of the utilities they have a relationship with. So that's there's sort of public engagement angle to that. Now the data set's been updated since I produced these slides. But this is essentially a combination of proprietary and publicly available open source data sets. So there's something called the Global Energy Monitor, formerly called Coal Swarm, and they update their databases quarterly. There's obviously Platts and the World Electric Power Plant Database, and other data sets as well that allow us to do this analysis, right? So you need the asset level data to do this kind of analysis, which kind of begs the question, where does this data exist for other sectors? And it hasn't until, well, I say until now. We're publishing these data sets in early next year, making them freely available. But they haven't been available on a global basis to do this kind of analysis for cement and iron and steel, which are two very polluting sectors of the global economy, representing 6% and 7% of global CO2 emissions, respectively. And I'll tell you how we've been doing that. And I mean, there's some proprietary data sets that we have been using, and I'll tell you how we've been using them. But they have partial coverage, and people that create these proprietary data sets, they tend to like to sweat the asset. So they have partial coverage. They're not updated particularly regularly. They're big data gaps, particularly in China, for both cement and iron and steel. A lot of the world's production is in those two, for those two sectors are in China. So that's a big data gap for a lot of the existing data sets. So how can we create these globally consistent, comparable asset level data sets that will then, one of the use cases is doing this incompatibility analysis. So we've created this open source database, and this has been driven primarily through Earth observation data and machine learning and AI methods. So we're collaborating with the Alan Turing Institute and the Satellite Applications Catapult through an initiative called the Spatial Finance Initiative to coordinate this work, where we're systematically training algorithms to identify assets that have the features of cement and iron and steel facilities. And then we are, depending on the type of information, then also doing other matching. So for example, there aren't that many of the assets. So, once we've identified the assets and verified that they are indeed a cement and iron and steel facility, who owns them? A lot of that still needs to be done manually through web scraping and so on and so forth. So there's so that's sort of a bit of a sense of the approach. This is identifying the assets and characterizing them, and then also we're sort of exploring how we might be able to use natural language processing once we've identified ownership, how we can track changes in ownership over time. And you can see the different, these are the different characteristics of the different types of asset, how things are changing over time. So I just wanted to sort of quickly show you that, and then also show you that we have been, so this is all unpublished, but will be coming out in 2021. This is for steel. You can see the Chinese steel assets here, which represent a very large proportion of global assets, and then a 1.5 degree carbon budget allocated to the steel sector. And I have borrowed these slides from colleagues in my group. And this is looking at ArcelorMittal specifically. And then you can look at countries as well. And this is, again, getting into the what does it mean for a financial institution? Okay, which are the steel producers that are least aligned, and how do we then? What does that then mean for a lending decision, investment decision, engagement action, or whatever it might be? So the other thing I wanted to sort of talk to you about was sort of nesting that all more broadly within spatial finance, because this work on power, cement, iron, and steel isn't a one-off. It's part of a kind of a bigger plan, and sort of in general, that the plan is predicated on moving away from that parent company level flow model to looking at individual assets that companies own, measuring the exposure of assets to risks, using a whole range of different measures of hazard, and aggregating that up to the company, and then aggregating that up further to the portfolio. And this framework, which I've mentioned the word bottom up a few times. This is kind of what I mean. So instead of it being parent company level disclosures, which I call top down, it is you're looking at the individual assets within a company and doing this measurement. And it's a risk framework. It's a way of analyzing risk. It's also a impact framework, an externality framework, because it allows you to measure the environmental and social impacts that assets have locally or globally, and then tie them to companies. So in terms of understanding the negative or positive externalities that companies have, and if you're an investor, you'll have a portfolio of companies, it helps you understand that as well, or could do. But of course, you can imagine there are all sorts of data questions here about the asset level information and how we get that, but also what are the right measures of risk, what are the right measures of different externalities. And this is all very simple stuff, in terms of some of the examples I'm about to show you. So it's asset level data tied to ownership, it's measures of risks and externalities, and it's, you can tie that to scenarios. And then, of course, if you're a financial institution, you might want to understand how a company's management is viewing these things. That's kind of out of scope, what I'm talking about. That's the job of asset managers. So companies A and B might have the same exposure to the same risks, but company A has a plan to manage those risks. That's kind of important information that will change your determination and your view about how risky a company is or not. And then you also need to take that information and input it into, use it as an input for different credit risk or financial models or economic models that you can then use in the case of a financial institution. So our work is very much focused on the first three things. And this is easy example. This should be more, we could do it for, I should have done this for East Asia or South Asia. But this is a hypothesis where, power stations located in areas with really bad air pollution are more likely to be prematurely closed or shuttered for whatever reason, for that reason, really. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to understand. And this approach allows you to do that. And of course, physical risks. This is business as usual drought risk. This is 1.5 degrees. You can see there's an awful lot more drought risk in the Mediterranean as a result of climate change in a business as usual scenario. And then you can link that to companies. So if you're an investor in European utilities, that might prompt some interesting conversations or some disinvestment decisions associated with Italian and Spanish utilities. And also, if you've got lots of geographical exposure, you can, you might want to zoom in and get a much more granular measure of drought risk or other forms of physical climate risk. And of course, you can do that. So you can see here we've used a very coarse global data set. You can see the size of the squares. CCS, this is again something we've been playing around with. A lot of the kind of policy work on CCS just assumes you can retrofit all power stations with CCS. That's obviously nonsense. So this is just applying some basic filters using asset level data. You're not going to, again, we're setting out some hypotheses. You're not going to retrofit something that's really small. You're probably not going to retrofit something that's really old. You're probably not going to retrofit something that's far away from viable geological storage. You're probably not going to retrofit something that's, not part of a cluster. You could create these quite easily, and then you can see if you apply those filters. Actually, it's a much narrower range of jurisdiction or bits of countries that are suitable for CCS retrofit if you believe that's something that's likely to happen. And it's kind of fun because you can look at, some of the utility statements, particularly more in the US actually than in Europe, where they're like, we're going to retrofit everything with CCS, and then you kind of do this analysis, and you can see that actually, hang on, guys, this doesn't look at all viable. So can you explain that? Again, this is sort of arming investors with a bit of information to ask sensible probing questions. This is heat stress, and we're starting to play around with protected areas, species and things like that, but this is actually much harder, as you might expect. This is part of a bigger endeavor around the integrating geospatial data and analysis into financial analysis. We have this initiative, the Spatial Finance Initiative, to do that. A key part of why this is so exciting at the moment is the massive explosion of Earth observation capabilities. Many more satellite launches, new constellations taking high-resolution pictures of every point on planet Earth every single day. Multispectral sensors, very high revisit times, all sorts of things. Hardware is getting better and cheaper. Same for artificial intelligence, and be able to interpret, scan through all of that imagery to make sense of it. What we kind of want to do is, and the power, cement, iron and steel work is the beginning of this, is really to try and sequence the real economy. So if we can characterize all the key assets, tie that to ownership for all the key sectors, particularly the most polluting sectors, and make that publicly available, it means financial institutions, civil society, governments, researchers can do much more sophisticated types of analysis than some of the easy stuff I've just shown you. It introduces a geospatial dimension to financial analysis, which doesn't actually exist. You would be surprised to know. But this is the key enabler, because without this data you can't do that, and it's a kind of a collective public good. We think that it's akin to the Human Genome Project in a way. You kind of need it to be a philanthropic, government-funded endeavor to do that systematically, and then people can build products and services off the back of it, and through the process also you can innovate. This is looking at some of the gaps we have. So this is looking at, this is just at emissions. Obviously, there are other ways you could prioritize this, but looking at contribution of global emissions and the availability of asset level data. So, power, we're in pretty good shape, and we're currently kind of here. We're probably going to start doing stuff on pulp and paper. and stuff on chemicals, oil and gas, refining. We'd love to do stuff on linear assets, but there, this is going to needs to be systematic. It needs to be sector by sector, because the other thing for finance is that a lot of people are sector specialists. They're interested in assets across an entire sector globally, and so this sort of speaks to that requirement. So I will stop there because I think I'm out of time, and we wanted 20 minutes for questions. But a bit of context on the current debates in finance and alignment, how a lot of the discourse is focused on climate risk management. We need to move to robust assessments of incompatibility, compatibility for carbon or climate. But there are all these broader opportunities as well, which I think are super exciting, and we're doing some cool stuff at Oxford. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was fantastic. And I see why it's situated in geography. You had some beautiful maps there for us. Thanks for those. And the questions starting to pour in. So the first one came from my colleague Flora about the embedded emission in renewables. Flora, do you want to ask Ben directly? Feel free to turn your camera and microphone on.
Hi. Hi, Ben. Thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. I was wondering about the section on power assets. Would it be relevant to include also data on renewable assets? Because although they have zero marginal carbon emissions, they do have emissions embedded in their production installation. So as such, they do have some lock-in committed emissions. So if you take those into account, some other assets might be pushed out of the carbon budget.
Yes, so we don't look at embedded emissions in the manufacture or production of the renewable energy infrastructure. We don't do that, and that's certainly something one could explore and is potentially quite interesting. So, but something out of scope for us.
So the next question we have is from Nick. Nick, again, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, hi Ben. Really interesting stuff. I'm particularly interested in the you moving on to sectors like steel and cement, which are carbon intensive but quite a small fraction of total emissions. So I assume that your an important parameter in your analysis is the sectoral division that you impose for any given global carbon budget. And I was wondering in particular, so how do you do that? But in particular, how do you deal with the fact that in some sectors, decarbonisation may be contingent on power sector decarbonisation, and particularly that the more distributed sectors like heat and transport are actually quite difficult to implement without power sector decarbonisation.
Yeah, really good points. So absolutely, the sectoral allocation choices are key. I mean, I think so where possible, well, pretty much throughout, we've kind of gone, look, we don't want to be the ones that are determining the sectoral allocation. There are other people who are better placed to do that, doing integrated assessment modelling and all the rest of it, and so we've kind of taken allocations off the shelf from third-party analysis and put that in the system. And we've also, I didn't show you the video of the platform because that video was out of date, but you can basically pick up the line and move it or put in your own carbon budget. So it's kind of the user can have their own view, and that's us kind of sidestepping that really difficult question. And then, and it also gets, originally we included all sorts of options to, you could pick your allocation method on, is it a per capita allocation? Is it a development allocation to developing countries get loads more, and then you'd end up with, of course you can do that. But we want to empower people to express their own preferences or use defaults rather than us making those decisions. And then the interrelationships between sectors, we haven't, I guess that gets reflected in your sectoral allocation. So it's sort of, again, sidestepping a really difficult but important bit of analysis.
Yeah, I think Charlie Fraddock has a related question. He wants to know where to invest. Charlie, do you want to ask Ben?
Yes, sorry. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, in terms of practical implications, if you are an asset manager, would it be better to invest in the best aligned assets within the industry you already happen to be investing in? Or would it be better to switch to a whole other industry which might be better aligned with carbon budgets altogether?
Yeah, the trillion-dollar question. I mean, obviously there are lots of people thinking about that challenge. I guess two observations. So the first is that, you know, it's all very well having a really, you know, sophisticated, nuanced approach to understanding compatibility or incompatibility for emitting assets in the power sector, but, you know, we're getting to the point where all this stuff is going to be incompatible, right? So, you know, there's not much scope for nuance in some of these sectors, increasingly as carbon budgets decrease, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, from a financial institution perspective, and indeed from a societal perspective, you know, we might want to think about the opportunities to support the transition of companies, and how do we do that? So it might not be about leaving whole sectors. It might be going, okay, well, actually this iron and steel company has the greatest potential to become net zero by installing XYZ, and that's a commercial opportunity. So you know, and we have lots of conversations with banks, for example, about exactly that. You know, this allows them to identify clients in their client portfolio who might benefit the most from the loans and the finance they can provide to them. And we might want to encourage that kind of thinking a bit more. Because the other thing, of course, is if some institutions withdraw their capital, others might step up. But that takes us down a sort of all sorts of an interesting debate around divestment and engagement, and what's the role of finance in all of this.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be more questions on that. So one more we have from Andrew. Andrew, do you want to ask Ben?
Yes, thank you. They're lovely looking graphics, aren't they? And they've got so much detail in them, and there's a big trap with lots of detail that people assume it's all very accurate. How much work have you been able to do on testing or on establishing how accurate your data is? And do you sample it? What do you do?
Yeah, really good question. So there is a broader kind of attempt that, so Freddie, Otto, myself, others are sort of hoping to kick off a big chunk of work on two things. One is confidence levels, and the other is suitability. So, you know, and this is not just about the quality of the asset level data I was showing you, and obviously we do, you know, we ground truth this stuff, but for all the data being used for climate and environmental analytics by financial institutions and indeed by other stakeholders, like what are the confidence levels associated with these different data sets? How can we clearly communicate that to users of the data? That's a real problem, because there isn't any of that really associated with the data that's being used by anyone. So big problem. And then the other is suitability. So, you know, are you using the right kind of data for the right kind of purpose? And you know, I'm not a climate scientist, but speaking to people like Freddie and others, you know, they get very frustrated seeing financial institutions or data providers, you know, there's sort of ecosystem of startups providing stuff to financial institutions, and the climate scientists look at some of the data they're using to come up with results, and they're like, you can't use these data sets for that purpose. So I think this is a really big big set of issues for not just the quality of the asset level data, but also the use of broader climate and environmental risk analytics. For some, the other thing to say is that for, I said that a lot of investors, financial institutions are interested in having global coverage for a sector, right? And implicit within that is an acceptance, even if you could figure out the confidence levels, which you can sort of sense check some of this stuff. But anyway, I can come back to that. They're willing to take quite high error bars, quite large or wide error bars to get a globally consistent database. So if you're looking at all the companies in a particular sector globally, it's different from if you're looking at 2 companies in Indonesia in a high level of resolution, right? So I think then this goes back to my suitability point. So some things are suitable for some purposes. You wouldn't use a coarse, less accurate global data set for a really kind of very specific type of analysis on one asset or a small portfolio of assets in one country. That wouldn't be the right use of the data. But if you're looking at all these listed companies, then that might be the right way to go about it.
Fantastic. I had a thought. So on all your abatement curves, they were all very positive emissions. How would you treat or credit people who, increasingly we hear more and more of people wanting to do direct air capture? Do you credit them for them in your assessments, if they were to claim to do that?
We've had these are things we've kind of talked about as a team and then kind of parked. So to focus on the core tasks at hand. So we haven't done anything on direct air capture. Of course, it's a way of calculating your offsetting requirement, right, and your offsetting liability. So there's sort of things we can do with this approach. So what's your carbon pricing liability? Well, if you figure out the cumulative carbon emissions of an asset tied to a company, obviously you need to make assumptions about carbon pricing. You can have a better go at coming up with carbon pricing liabilities than some of the other approaches that exist.
Excellent. We've got one general question, Ben. Will your slides be available? Are you happy to share them?
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to share a PDF. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, Anne has already responded. They will be available. Fantastic. Thank you. Right. If there are any more questions, just pop them into the chat. We're getting thank yous. Now is your chance to ask more questions if you like. I was quite interested in your work with the Alan Turing Institute and the satellite data. Probably completely the wrong question because you said we should focus on stocks rather than flows. But I wondered, is there any scope to assess the emissions from these assets from satellite data?
Yeah, and I was being maybe a bit flippant about, obviously it's important to understand flows, but there needs to be a bit of a slight rebalancing. So there are initiatives. There's one initiative you might have had in mind called Climate Trace, which has been set up recently to basically get asset level emissions data for some of the sectors we're looking at. Now, to do that, obviously you need to know where the assets are, and they're different. There are ways you might be able to measure greenhouse gas emissions from space. So there are already small constellations up there looking at methane, but because CO2 is a much smaller molecule, that's harder. But you can, there have been attempts, people are working on this in our network and through that initiative, around how you can you estimate emissions properly, looking at other, if you can tell that the power station's on, basically better estimation methodologies, using geospatial data, which are very important. I think the prospect of having a combination of space-based constellations plus other forms of sensor plus drones, basically creating that near real-time CO2 greenhouse gas emissions kind of MRV system globally, totally technically possible.
Yeah.
And pretty cool. But I think a lot of that is dependent less on. You do need the satellite information, and you do need the regular revisit times, but particularly for CO2, a lot of it's more is local sensors, instrumenting different things to collect that information.
And have you found, with your sort of incompatibility measurements, do markets start to penalize companies for being incompatible?
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of research around, outflows from carbon-intensive fossil fuel sectors. I guess part of the problem is that there isn't really a kind of a widely agreed upon measure of incompatibility to do some of the analysis. So this is one crack at doing that. So that's definitely an important research question that people are looking at. But it's less about incompatibility and more about kind of broader ESG issues, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ben. That's been brilliant. We had lots of interesting questions. Thank you so much for those as well. And after we've learned today about some of the things we might need to do less of, next week we've got Charlie Wilson, who, those of you who don't know, very, very interesting character, who's looking at the diffusion of new stuff and new technologies and how they basically spread. So please join us again next week for that. But for now, let's thank Ben. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.